Hello, Internet. So, it's good to see you again. Today I'm going to talk about the doldrums of war and peace. What do I mean by that? How can there be doldrums in war and peace? Well, here's the reality. In a world where there are wars in a 24-hour news cycle that get covered from end to end by thousands of reporters who run like rats to cover the action. And I don't say that to disrespect rats, but they all want a piece of it. The attention span of the viewer, the audience, is limited because there are constantly new battles to cover, new wars to cover, new conflicts to cover, new scandals to cover. There's no shortage of conflict in the human condition, unfortunately, at this time. What does that leave us with? That leaves us with a never-ending cycle of journalists looking for new things to sell their editors, new stories for them to pitch, new angles for them to take. They forget about the big picture very quickly and focus on some micro details. And eventually, when the audience is bored, they move on to the next topic, because that is how they sell the ads between the stories. No ads, no ad dollars, no ad dollars, no content publishers. It's really quite simple. You need not look further than what's happening on X to know what I'm talking about. Last week, in the book deal's annual meeting hosted by Andrew Ross Sorkin of the New York Times, who Elon Musk errantly called Jonathan last week at the conference while sitting on stage with him. Musk told Jonathan that if advertisers didn't want to advertise on X, they could go F themselves. And by F, I don't mean fudge. And he repeated it. And you could see very clearly the look on Andrew Ross Sorkin's face, Jonathan's face, as Musk basically announced that he's willing to forego the entire X company and turn it into yet another heap in the dustbin of once interesting internet sites. Well, I guess when you're worth hundreds of billions of dollars, a $44 billion loss on a stupid thing you said once and couldn't back out of isn't the worst thing in the world that could happen to him. Though it's certainly not great for the thousands of employees who lost their jobs as a result of him buying the company, and the thousands left who will probably lose theirs when the company goes down in flames. And down it seems to be going. And why do I say that? Well, consider that many of the top advertisers have already pulled out of advertising on X, precisely because the content that was matching the ads was not to the liking of the advertisers. Meaning, Advertisers were seeing their ads pop up next to content that they would rather not see it next to. For example, posts by some rather extremist right-wingers, nationalists, supremacists, whatever you want to call it. And they frankly had enough of his antics over the past year or so that they're just not willing to put up with it anymore. They would rather put their money where they feel safer, not damaging the reputation of their brand that they've worked so hard to build. Some of whom have been working at that for decades. And if you look at the big advertisers, all of them have been working at it for decades, if not a century or more. So why does this relate to the doldrums of war and peace? Well, X is a brand that has been damaging itself from the beginning by not caring about the big picture of its own well-being, and has been dealing with the minutia of ridiculous ideas and silly errant posts by its owner. In fact, the latest silly errant post by its owner is one that Musk called possibly the silliest thing that he'd ever done on the platform. And what was that post? That post was him agreeing with or supporting a basically anti-Semitic trope, effectively by one person who said that what's happening in the war between Israel and Hamas and the byproduct of it turning into anti-Israel and anti-Jewish sentiment was a result of the war, and that nobody really cared about the condition of the widespread and growing anti-Semitism throughout the world. Effectively saying anti-Semitism is the Jews' fault. To which Mr. Musk said, effectively, you are telling the truth. Which is a horrible thing for him to have said, considering it's a flat-out lie. It is absolutely an anti-Semitic trope. And because he was met with a significant amount of backlash, he felt the need to go to Israel on a kind of apology tour, visiting the sites of the October 7th attack and seeing for himself the damage that Hamas had unleashed without provocation, and then meeting with the President of Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel and saying he would work to improve X and not promote such kind of tropes. Not in so many words. And this is one of the doldrums of war and peace. In this case, the doldrums of war. Why is it part of the doldrums of war? Because it is part of a narrative, regardless of which side you're on, that looks for new angles to take regarding the conflict before the audience is tired of the topic. And it's also part of the effort to not let one side win, notably the Israeli side, which clearly has the upper hand in terms of overwhelming military power, because the interest of publishers is to have never-ending conflicts that they can return to whenever the next cycle gets boring. So, it seems that my initial analysis that this war will not end the way a lot of people think, unfortunately, is correct. And there is other evidence to demonstrate this fact. Over the weekend, or Friday, whenever it was, a New York Times reporter had reported that the Israeli government knew about this potential attack for at least a year. Now, I've obviously gone over the revelations that this attack was actually known even 6 years ago or so, when the then Minister of Government, Avigdor Lieberman, had reported that there was a possible war going to happen, and that it would take on a scale unlike any Israel had seen before, in terms of an asymmetric war of an attack by terrorists, then to be met with a massive response by the Israelis. And even though Netanyahu had ignored it then, and 6 years seems so long in the Middle East, he was reminded of this possibility in an updated report, and the attack plan was called, in Israeli intelligence circles, the Walls of Jericho, referencing the old biblical Walls of Jericho. And it was basically ignored. And the defenders of the Prime Minister basically said, no, he didn't know about it. Sure. Believe that, then I have beachfront property to sell you in South Dakota. Why am I so confident that the Prime Minister knew? Because there isn't a thing that all of the intelligence general staff and all of the military brass would have known about that was even being floated around by the initial analysts. Too many people in the officers' corps that would get so widespread that everyone in the country knew, at least anyone in a position of authority or knowledge, would not have reported to the Prime Minister. Why am I confident of this? Because Israel is a small country whose top priority is its national defense, and not in a metaphysical sense, in a very real sense. So there is literally no chance that the Prime Minister of Israel, a country constantly at war with its neighbors who have not made peace with it, namely the Palestinians, and the Syrians and the people in Lebanon, or the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Lebanese government, technically, are constantly in a state of conflict. And other countries like Iran, who pose a real threat to Israel, and their proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, pose a significant threat for attacks like this. So it is simply not believable that the Prime Minister, who brands himself as Mr. Security above all else, even above such things as freedom and liberty and democracy, would not have known about it. And if he did in fact not know about it, then the only excuse for it, which is not an excuse, is a dereliction of duty. Which means either the Prime Minister knew and carried out a dereliction of duty by knowing and not doing anything about it, or he didn't know what one of the most realistic dangers to the country was, in which case that was a dereliction of duty for not demanding to know what are the top threats, or what are the top perceived threats according to the top intelligence analysts. What is the purpose of having top intelligence analysts if you don't at least routinely get their best analysis and make judgments based on that information? So either way, the Prime Minister is responsible. There is no question about that. Yes, his defenders will say, no, he didn't know, therefore he's not responsible. Again, if he didn't know, he is responsible, because it means he was responsible for dereliction of duty as the Prime Minister of Israel. And this slipped by because of the doldrums of war and peace. The excuse was given that the Prime Minister was busy dealing with protests against his so-called reforms and having to deal with unrest in the West Bank, which his extremist right-wing government had effectively aggravated. Now, you can agree or disagree with settlement or whatever being built. You can agree or disagree with the right of Israelis to build homes, and saying that that is not equivalent to using violence. And I personally would agree with that. Although I understand people take the other side of that argument. In my opinion, it still does not justify the use of violence. Building a house is not the same thing as attacking somebody physically. And if you're going to tell me they're stealing our land, well, I would argue, no, they're not stealing the land. That land was conquered in war. And they're not stealing the land from a state that never existed. They conquered the land from Jordan, and they've been building houses in the land they conquered from Jordan, upon which there was no such thing as a state of Palestine beforehand. And these things happened during the doldrums of peace, that is, the building of houses, when nobody was paying attention, or very few people. Of course, obviously, activists are paying attention at all times. People engaged in whatever side are paying attention at all times, but the broader world was not. And so it came to pass that houses were built. This does not mean that these houses were illegal. This does not mean that these houses were built on stolen land. But if you want to take that side of the argument, well, we can debate that and look at the facts and the history in an active way. Nevertheless, in this cycle of the doldrums of peace, while these things were happening, and while there was unrest happening in the territory of Judea and Samaria, which anti-Israel folks tend to call the West Bank, while the rivers were just the West Bank, because they try to deny the existence of Jewish people in Judea and Samaria, historically the homelands of the Jewish people, dating back thousands and thousands of years. It was a very convenient period for both sides covering this particular issue, for both agenda, right? Regardless of which information outlets you view as valid, the doldrums of peace allowed for the continuation of this conflict, only to resume when the sparks flew into war in an unprovoked attack by the Hamas against Israel. And one of the most evident and terrible costs of taking such a conflict and turning it into the banal is that the spark of anger that was lit on October 7th, the spark of rage, the spark of hatred that demonstrated itself by the Hamas, is that they managed to kill more than 1,000 people in Israeli territory, most of whom were Israeli Jews, but many of whom were also foreign workers and other nationals who just happened to be in the way of the Hamas and their bullets and their evil plans to do as much damage and cause as much terror and capture as many hostages as they possibly could. And the excuse now, in what is quickly becoming the doldrums of war, is that the Hamas captured the hostages in order to bargain later, to bargain for the release of prisoners, which is patently absurd when you consider the amount of devastation that they knew they would bring upon themselves. So, if they claim that they wanted to capture hundreds of soldiers and civilians in order to release some thousands of prisoners, at what cost? If they claim 15,000 people are dead as a result of this Israeli reaction, then they made a very poor calculus. And they are responsible for that cost. Deny it as they will. Anyway, I'll have more to say about this later. Happy days.